London's dusk has long since fallen. We step into this city cloaked in shadow and smoke. Here lies no splendor of palaces but forgotten corners, narrow alleys, and deep mines seated poverty. Tonight we shall traverse the foul air of street Giles. Slums as a newcomer. You shall face trials, prepare yourself. But if you enjoy my tales, take a moment to subscribe. Tell me where you come from at this very moment, and did I long to see who would join. Now, dim the lights. Join me in uncovering the tale of Monday, 17th October 1814. You must understand the land where events unfolded. Imagine this forgotten corner of London, its winding, twisting lanes. The parish of Street Giles. At its darkest heart stood a suffocating slum, known as the Raven's Nest. This was no ordinary neighborhood, but a labyrinth of life squeezed between Bloomsbury's elegant streets, Oxford Street's bustling traffic, and Tottenham Court Road's clamour. The poor dwelled here not by choice, but by sheer destitution. 1814 London was in a period of mixed emotions, separated from the bustling thoroughfares of Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road. This was the refuge of the city's outcasts, not by choice, but by necessity. London in 1814 was complex. The long war with France was nearing its end. The Duke of Wellington had become a national hero, and the city brimmed with pride. Yet beneath the surface, London lay exhausted, overpopulated, socially fractured. Behind every gleaming mansion lay hundreds of hovels like those in Street Giles's district. Street Giles's slums were no different. Streets bearing names like New Street or George Street were mere pretensions. Between soaring, leaning buildings, only narrow alleys offered passage, obscuring the sky. The air thick with London's coal smoke. Closer still, the stench of gin, simmering cabbage, unwashed bodies, and the foul odor from open drains serving as sewers. Buildings bear the marks of centuries. Houses meant for one family repeatedly subdivided. Rooms partitioned by thin boards, until 100 dwell together. Light is as precious as money. Upper rooms dim, lower ones dark still. True misery lies in the cellars. These spaces are not storehouses, but dwellings born of rent minus saving necessity. Entire families huddle in subterranean cubicles, living beneath the city's surface. The sole light seeps through grimy iron grates at street level, walls perpetually damp with London clay. The air was icy. Mold was everywhere. In these cellars, the line between life and death seemed perilously thin. Many infants perished. Diseases like tuberculosis raged. Life was hard and dangerous. The residents were mostly English paupers and Irish immigrants seeking work. They eked out a living on building sites, docks and in workshops. Yet poverty and prejudice confined them to districts like Street Giles. Here, a tight knit community formed, bound by a shared language, faith and shared hardship. Wake minus keeping for the deceased was a vital ritual, a rare moment of communal cohesion in this world of scarcity. The dilapidated neighborhood buzzed ceaselessly. Children played endlessly in the mud. Women washed clothes or mended garments. Men fortunate enough to find work returned home utterly exhausted after 12 or 14 hours labor, seeking only brief respite with a pipe clenched between teeth and a swig of cheap beer. This is a fragile world, society squeezed into a space too small to bear it. Each person resembles a precarious structure, nestled within a larger, swaying edifice. Damp brick walls and rotten beams rooted in soft earth. They dwell in the city's lowest depths. This geographical reality destined to become a deadly trap. Their homes were no shelters, but cages, placing them on an unimaginable path to catastrophe that forced gathering silently, just a few streets away, casting long shadows over Street Giles. Here stands another edifice symbolizing a different London, the Horseshoe Mine-shaped brewery on the east side of Tottenham Court Road, operated by the Mux's Company. If the slums embody human survival, this brewery represents extraordinary productivity. This colossal machine exists for one purpose, alone brewing beer. Its brick walls loom tall and sombre, darkened by decades of coal dust, towering chimneys, few ash miners' grey smoke, proclaiming the ceaseless activity within. The sounds emanating from the brewery are the very pulse of the new age, the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam pumps, the rumble of heavy lorries, the shouts of foremen directing labour. The entire brewery is an industrial complex. The barley processing area imparts the beer's flavour. In the boiler room, fires burn coal to generate steam. Craftsmen fashion thousands of wooden barrels in the workshop. Within vast storage rooms and fermentation vats, beer quietly matures. The entire operation is a marvel of scale and efficiency. Its proprietors, such as the esteemed Sir Henry Meeks, inhabited a world apart from their neighbours in the Rockley slum. For them, the brewery was a fountain of prestige and wealth for London. It stood as an iconic landmark. Its porter brew became the lifeblood of the working class, a beer of deep, rich colour, full miner's body texture, and robust strength, born upon London's streets a century ago. Both economical and nutritious, it became the spiritual mainstay of dockers and construction sites. A pint of porter, for London households, was akin to a full meal. Porter is no pale ale, and few as deep, rich and robust. This century minus old London minus born brew, with its affordable price, its rich nutritional content and robust character, became the backbone of dockers and construction sites. For families living in single rooms, a pint of porter was as substantial as a full meal, and a cheap solace in hard time. Its name derives from its popularity among the city's porters, those who shouldered London's heavy labour. It was precisely these workers who made Max's Porter master. Max's Porter gained renown throughout the city for its exceptional quality, and ranked among the foremost producers in a London utterly devoted to this brew. Day after day, the brewery gates swung open for heavy chairless horses laden with cask. These steeds toiled ceaselessly. In this city intoxicated by beer, they stand among the foremost brewers. Day after day, the brewery gates swing open for carts drawn by towering Shire horses, laden with casks bound for London's 1,000 pubs. Each cask represents profit, yet also carries drinkers' fleeting hopes of worldly escape. The brewery embodies strength, reliability, and London's commercial supremacy, as steadfast as the rising sun, its rhythms as predictable as the dawn. And within the brewery grounds, the most magnificent structure, that colossal barrel house, is the ultimate expression of this confidence, as regular as the sunrise. Within the most magnificent building on the grounds, that ominous, inspiring giant vessel is the ultimate expression of this confidence. Atrium Arval, let us step inside, away from the courtyard's clamour, into the cool, dimly lit fermenting hall. Here, the air is thick with the rich aroma of yeast and malt, so fragrant it borders on intoxicating. This is the brewery's sanctuary, the cathedral of fermentation. The building itself is immensely grand, its soaring ceiling supported by sturdy wooden beams. Yet, even this vast space pales before the colossal fermentation vats, overshadowed by the immense structures they contain. The fermentation barrels stand like silent giants in formation, among which one undeniable sovereign reigns, supreme, a structure of astonishing design, bearing witness to the ambition and craftsmanship of its builder's era. This is the Horseshoe Brewery's colossal fermentation vat, standing 20-2 feet tall, approximately 6.7 meters, equivalent to a standard to minus story house. It towers even higher than that. A person standing at its base must look up to see the top. Its diameter is equally astonishing, spanning over 60 feet at its widest point, approximately 3 meters. At its widest point, it reaches 60 feet. It is not a simple cylinder, but an exquisite conical structure formed by massive vertical planks known as staves. Each stave is a masterpiece of woodworking, fitted perfectly to its neighbor. The timber was likely Baltic spruce, chosen for its strength. Its import cost was prohibitively high. Binding this wooden colossus together to create a watertight seal between the staves was a series of massive iron hoops, 8 to 9 hoops encircled the barrel's height, each several inches wide, forged by blacksmiths and fitted were reed-hot. As they cooled and contracted, they exerted immense pressure, locking the staves together with unyielding strength. The hoop bearing the greatest pressure at the barrel's widest base is an indestructible ring forged from wrought iron, installed where reed-hot. Its contraction upon cooling generates immense pressure, locking the staves together with formidable force. The hoop bearing the greatest pressure at the barrel's widest base is an indestructible ring forged from wrought iron, installed while reed-hot. As it cools, contraction generates immense pressure, locking the staves tightly together, inches thick, forged by blacksmiths, installed while reed-hot. Upon cooling and shrinking, it grips the timber with astonishing force. At the base where pressure is greatest near the liquid level, encircled by the thickest iron hoop and engine, hearing marvel in itself. It is not merely a vessel, but an industrial architectural masterpiece, constructed over months by dozens of craftsmen. It stands as the pride of MUX Company and a London landmark. Tourists and Londoners alike often make special trips to view the colossal cask. Upon its completion in 1810, it is said a banquet for 200 was held within a similar cask to celebrate. This event showcased the industrial marvel of the era, both a symbol of the times and a testament to human ingenuity. Visitors journey specifically to view the colossal beer vat. 1810, it is said that to celebrate its completion, a banquet for 200 was held within a similar giant vessel, an act that underscored the awe inspired by these monumental structures. They were emblems of their era, proof that mankind could now conceive and construct colossal works once unimaginable. Yet let us look beyond the exterior. Focus instead on function and inner workings. The vessel held a fermenting mixture of water, malted barley and hops. This bubbling liquid, known as wort, would eventually become port wine. Its capacity was almost unimaginable. Records indicate it could hold over 3,500 barrels of beer. The standard brewing barrel at the time was 36 imperial gallons. Simple calculations reveal a total capacity of 126 Zorro imperial gallons. A single imperial gallon of pure water weighs over 10 pounds. Sugary beer is slightly heavier. Thus, the full tank's liquid weight can be estimated at over 1,200,000 pounds, approximately 600 tons. This equates to the weight of a small naval vessel. And all this was supported solely by timber and iron hoops at a height of 20-2 feet. The critical factor was the immense and uneven pressure exerted by such a liquid column, with the greatest force concentrated at the base. Every square inch of the cask's bottom wall endured relentless outward pressure. The entire stability of this 6-100-ton column of port depended entirely on the strength of its lowest plank, and paramount among these was the massive iron hoop encircling the base. For years it had performed its duty flawlessly, having endured countless cycles of filling, emptying, and refilling. Staves swelled and shrank with pressure. The iron band and endured deformation. It was a famously dependable servant, underpinning the brewery's ambitions. On Monday afternoon, 17th October 1814, the colossal vat neared capacity. Holding port aged for nearly 10 months, this precious dark brew was about to be released. The brewery operated as usual, though Monday afternoons carried a slightly slower rhythm. Outside, life in Street Giles and the wider city continued obliviously, amidst the dim, fragrant atmosphere of the cask room, where house manager George Creek conducted his routine inspection, checking gauges, monitoring temperatures, ensuring the fermentation process proceeded smoothly. Familiar tasks in familiar surroundings. As he passed beneath the colossal vats, His experienced eye might have detected something amiss, perhaps a faint seep from a seam, or perhaps his ears suddenly caught a new sound, that metallic moan, utterly unlike the brewery's everyday clatter. Official records later stated, at approximately 3:30 from the afternoon, Mr. Creek noted a leak in one of the 7 vats, a minute trickle seeping from the seam, or perhaps a strange sound brushed past his ears, that metallic moan, so utterly unlike the brewery's everyday clatter. Official records later stated, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Mr. C.I.K. observed that one of the 700-pound iron hoops encircling the barrel's base had become loose. It had not yet snapped, but had shifted from its position. The immense tension had been compromised. He recognized the potential danger, though perhaps did not foresee its immediacy or severity. Such issues, though rare, did occur in large barrels. Standard procedure demanded immediate reporting to superiors, prompt emptying of the barrel, and summoning a cooper and blacksmith for repairs. The loss of a batch of beer, while a significant financial blow, was far preferable to the barrel rupturing. Mr. C.I.K. dutifully reported his discovery. He was reportedly told it's not a major issue, and it will be dealt with properly. The value of the beer inside became a compelling reason to delay drastic measures. Thus, for the next hour, the barrel remained undisturbed. 600 tons of liquid pressed outward relentlessly. The remaining hoops strained to bear the load of the failed ones. Millions of pounds of potential energy, suspended 20 feet above, pressed upon the sole point of weakness. The laws of physics accumulated force with constant, merciless precision, awaiting the moment when the weary iron hoops would finally snap. On that Monday afternoon, George Creek, warehousekeeper for the Mo Brewery, performed his duties with measured steps. A man who knew his limits. His world was defined by vast brick vaulted halls, the air thick with malt sweetness and hop bitterness. Wooden Dian's colossal presence defined the space. The brewery on Tottenham Court Road was not merely a factory, but an industrial temple aid testament to the city's insatiable thirst. And its most sacred site is the central altar like port wine vat. This is no ordinary cask, but an architectural masterpiece of 20 to foot all wooden tower. Such a colossal structure serves as a landmark for those familiar with the brewery. It is not held together by ordinary wooden staves, but by massive iron hoops, each weighing 700 pounds. This vat is a masterpiece of cooper's art. The pressure and volume bears approach geological proportions. Within its dark, leaking walls, over 30-5,000 imperial gallons of port undergoes slow fermentation. It is this patient process that imparts the liquoric to invigor. Such vast quantities are scarcely imaginable. Equivalent to 1,000,000 pints, weighing over 580 tons. This dark lake of spirits, suspended to stories high, held together solely by the resilience of timber and the sheer force of iron hoops. George Creek, though adept at warehouse inventory, was no engineer. By training, his skill lay in reconciling ledgers and lists. His trained eyes should have keenly detected leaks, recording stock, to ensure London's favourite tipple flowed unimpeded. Yet now, something caught his eye. It was neither a drip, nor a stain, nor the sound of splintering wood, but something more subtle and more unsettling. At the curved apex of the colossal vat, a main iron hoop, thick as a man's forearm, had shifted. It had not snapped, at least not yet, merely slipped silently. Now it hung askew, inches from its original position. The once even, immense tension had shifted. A hair-thin trail of dark port beer trailed along the rim of the hoop, the mark of its displacement. Below, the staves had loosened. Internal pressure became uneven. The adjacent hoops above and below now bore greater strain. Creek paused his pen. The suspended fountain pen instantly lost its flavour amidst the brewery's pungent aroma. He stared at this conundrum How could a 7-100-pound iron hoop shift? This barrel had always stood as immovable as a mountain. Now it seemed to harbor some subtle omen, some energy. He could almost feel the tremor within the living liquid, yeast and sugar transforming into alcohol and carbon dioxide through slow, powerful churning, accumulating relentless pressure. He strained his ears. The warehouse was never truly silent. Distant hoofbeats outside the windows, the low rumble of the barrels, the intermittent shouts of the workers. But the giant cask itself was now making a new sound, a rumble more sensed than heard, the weight of 1,000 tons, the compressed wood fibers protesting as they sought a new equilibrium. For a man like George Creek, this was a matter for reporting, not repair. He was a cog in the precision machinery of Max's company. His duty to observe and report. He found the warehouse manager, whose name has been lost to time, but his actions in George Creek pointed to the cracks, explaining what he saw. Loose hoops, minor seepage, the wood's persistent murmur. The manager came to inspect. He looked up and gazed for a moment. This ordinary silent scene was the very turning point of the entire disaster. No panic, no premonition of impending doom. This cask had stood for years. Its sheer bulk created an illusion of immovability. What did a slightly shifted hoop matter to such a colossus? Merely a maintenance issue. The coopers could mend it when time permitted. The distillery was busy. Skilled coopers were perpetually in short supply. Empty the cask immediately. That would take hours. And squander priceless aged spirits. Utterly mad, an overreaction. Both commercial logic and probability argued against it. The decision makers, possessing absolute confidence in their systems, made their choice with calm deliberation. They would not sound a full alarm. Instead, they proceeded through official channels, composing a formal letter, addressed to either Mr. Mecht, the winery partner, or the maintenance supervisor, notifying them of the required repair. They reasoned. The iron hoop would hold the barrel together, and the cask itself would hold as it always had. The letter was composed in meticulous handwriting, calmly and professionally describing the situation, requesting a cooper be dispatched to inspect, and, if possible, hammer the massive iron hoop back into place. George Creek, having fulfilled his duty, returned to his ledgers to continue his work. The letter was set aside, awaiting dispatch. Meanwhile, within the vast wooden tower, pressure continued to mount. Indifferent to the memorandum and the sluggish rhythms of industrial bureaucracy, the groaning of timber grew heavier, that deep resonance gradually blending into the brewery's background hum. This warning, though heard, recorded, was ultimately tragically ignored. Afternoon light dimmed, the shadows of fermentation vats lengthened across the flagstone floor. For roughly an hour, the world maintained a precarious equilibrium. The memo lay untouched on the desk. The clerk continued his work, while 580-5 tons of fermenting mash relentlessly sought its breaking point. When the collapse came, it was unambiguous, not a seepage into a flood, but an explosion, such a vast and sudden release of energy, so immense and abrupt, that it rendered witnesses sensory-minus deprived. At approximately 5 o'clock in the evening, the delicate equilibrium within the colossal fermentation vessel shattered completely. A loosened iron hoop, the first sign of deep structural fatigue, ultimately gave way entirely. It did not merely slip, but snapped violently. The deafening roar was not the fracture of metal, but the thunderous reverberation of an artillery shell within the warehouse's enclosed cavity. The shrill crack of tearing iron echoed between the soaring brick walls. This single point of failure provided precisely the leverage the immense internal pressure required. Within the following microseconds, the load instantly transferred to the next iron hoop. The laws of physics are absolute and unforgiving. The second hoop, subjected to forces far exceeding its design limits, held for mere fractions of a second, before snapping with a deafening crack. The third and fourth followed in rapid succession. A catastrophic chain reaction propagated longitudinally along the cask, as if a colossal zip fastener had been ripped apart. The sounds were no longer isolated explosions, but the tearing of metal and the scattering of wood splinters. 20 to foot high staves, each a massive plank wove violently hurled skyward. They did not fall, but were propelled by the violent release of over 500,000 kilograms of liquid. Cannonball minus light. They streaked across the warehouse. The initial blast wasn't from port wine, but from compressed gas and atomized liquid island shockwave of carbon dioxide and evaporating alcohol erupting from the ruptured vessel. This shockwave alone extinguished every lantern and candle in the warehouse, plunging it instantly into a roaring darkness. Shattered glass fragments whirled in the twilight. The building's foundations shook violently, as if by an earthquake. Workers in other areas of the brewery felt the deep, terrifying tremors through their boots, as though the very foundations were collapsing. Then the liquid erupted, not flowing out, but exploding like dark, foamy port wine. 600 tons of liquid surged with locomotive force. This was no passive leak. It was a liquid explosion. The immediate impact of the surging wave obliterated everything in its path. The warehouse also held other smaller barrels and hundreds of giant casks. Each contained hundreds of gallons of port, awaiting transport. They were now as fragile as paper. The first tsunami minus-like surge from the giant casks crashed into these barrels, triggering an industrial minus-scale domino effect. The crackling of ruptured casks drowned in a greater roar the screech of barrels bursting between iron hoops. The deep, surging clash of liquids. Each ruptured barrel poured its contents into the torrent, instantly expanding its volume. Within a mere minute, a single cask's failure escalated into total collapse. The splintering of planks, the snapping of iron hoops, and the deep splash of colliding liquids intertwined. Each ruptured cask poured its contents into the torrent. The instantaneous surge in volume within a minute transformed a single cask's failure into the complete collapse of the brewery's entire stock. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter, now unleashed, became a chaotic, semi-minus liquid torrent barely contained by the warehouse's brick walls. The structure itself began to collapse. A murky flow churned with debris from shattered casks and splintered timber, while the remains of colossal barrels violently struck the internal supporting walls. Bricks and stones originally laid to support the roof rather than withstand lateral pressure from hundreds of tons of liquid began to warp and crack. The scene within the dark warehouse was unimaginably chaotic. The 10 to 15 foot deep, black, roaring torrents wept through the space. Entire sections of casks floated upon it like rafts. The surface churned with thick, tawny yeast foam, amidst deafening noise. The liquid continued its thunderous roar. The grinding debris now mingled with the groaning protest of the brewery's load-bearing wall. This 20 5 foot thick rear wall, originally facing the dilapidated shanty towns of Street Giles's slums, now serving as a makeshift dome role it was never meant to fulfill. The surging liquid beasted. Wooden wreckage battered the wall like a battering ram. The mortar between ancient bricks began to hiss and crumble. The wall visibly bulged outward, struggling against a force belonging to the sea. The thunderous fracture was not yet complete. Energy merely transformed. After a final, terrifyingly still few seconds, it sought its next most devastating outlet. The black torrent that followed obeyed a terrifyingly simple physical law. When the brewery's rear wall finally collapsed, it came crashing down without warning. No cracks, no gradual crumbling. The entire 20 5 high brick structure exploded under the relentless pressure of the churning lake of porter beer, and shattered outward. The sound of the collapsing wall was already drowned out by the deeper guttural roar of the surging liquid. What flooded into the narrow confines of New Street was no ordinary flood, but a tidal wave, a 15 foot high wall of dark liquid. a solid wall of crushed timber and brick. Its movement was not the gentle ebb and flow of a mild tide, but the savage, swift fury of a breached dam. This was no mere beer, but the sludge of industrial ruin. The wave was composed of hundreds of thousands of gallons of port beer. Its natural viscosity intensified by jumbled debris fragments from colossal cast, stumbling like saplings in the torrent, twisted iron hoops spinning in the foam, further churned with crushed brick and mortar from collapsed walls. This liquid battering ram struck London's most vulnerable, densely packed district, the slums of Street Giles. The slums formed a labyrinthine maze of narrow streets, crowded courtyards, and filthy alleyways. The buildings were shoddy and utterly unstable. Most dwellings were of inferior timber and brick construction. Foundations were often mere shallow trenches. More deadly still were the basements of many tenements, those damp subterranean chambers, connected only by steep, single minor step staircase, yet rented to the city's most desperate families. These basements, barely sheltering against the cold, were about to become inescapable graves. The floodwaters, surging with astonishing force from the brewery, gushed directly into the narrow waterways of New Street. The very topography of the slum now turned against its inhabitants, concentrating the flood's destructive power into a cone. The streets acted like nozzles on a hose, maintaining wave height as they raced forward. Its power lay not in depth, but in initial momentum. When it struck the first row of houses, it was not a gradually rising tide, but a colossal shockwave. The flimsy walls of the brewery minus facing shacks offered no resistance. The houses were not swept away, but violently struck inward. The entire front structure of each building crashed down. The shattering of timber, the disintegration of brick mingled with the flood's roar. The torrent indiscriminately swallowed all in its path. Street minor sparked carriages vanished instantly. Lift stocks sank into the abyss of dark, frothy depths. The current tore through the lower levels of ruined walls. With equal indifference, it swept away furniture, possessions, and living beings. Yet the deadliest destruction occurred underground. Floodwaters poured down narrow staircases into inhabited cellars. It was no trickle seeping through, but a cascade plunging like a waterfall, a solid column of liquid and debris, filling the entire room in less than a minute. For those trapped within, it was the moment families gathered for a simple meal, mothers tending to their children, with no time to react. The first sign of danger was a deafening roar, followed by the collapse of the house above. A suffocating black torrent struck instantly. This liquid was no clear water, but a viscous fermented mass. As the enclosed space flooded, it rapidly depleted oxygen and released vast quantities of carbon dioxide. Victims faced a triple threat: blunt trauma from the flood's impact, the sheer terror of drowning, and the double blow of rapid asphyxiation within the confined space. As it filled the confined space, it rapidly depleted oxygen and released carbon dioxide. Victims faced a triple threat: blunt trauma from the torrent and debris, the terror of drowning, and rapid asphyxiation from toxic gases in the sealed cellar. The floodwaters diverted from New Street. Part surged into George Street. Part rushed towards Russell Street, following the path of least resistance. It slammed into the side wall of the Tavistock Armory pub, a popular local haunt. The pub's walls collapsed under the water pressure, burying teenage barmaid Eleanor Cooper beneath a heap of sodden rubble and broken bricks. The pub's cellar was instantly flooded. The floodwaters continued their rampage. The beloved local pub's walls caved under the water pressure, burying teenage barmaid Eleanor Cooper beneath a wet heap of rubble and broken bricks. The pub's cellar was instantly submerged. The floodwaters continued their rampage, washing the narrow alleyway clean. In a certain apartment building, a group of mourners gathered for a wake, an Irish family holding a vigil for their old boy who had passed away the day before. Mother Anne Soville and her husband mourned alongside their 4 other children. As the floodwaters violently struck the building, the floor suddenly collapsed, sweeping everyone into the basement below, which was rapidly filling with the surging torrent from the street. The scene descended into utter terror and chaos, the wake transformed by an unforeseeable catastrophe into a collective burial ground. As the floodwaters spread further afield, their destructive force began to wane. Yet by then, the heart of the Raven's Nest district, the utterly devastated floodwaters filled every cellar, shattered every fragile wall, leaving deep scars. Streets vanished entirely, replaced by shallows of burned debris, from which the wails of the wounded and trapped slowly rose. The air across several blocks hung thick with the scent of port beer cloying like sweetened viscous. For the survivors, this scent shall forever be divorced from merriment, linked only to sudden darkness and unnameable death. The flood did not arrive with a thunderous roar. First came a deep, resonant, structural groan. 126,000 imperial gallons of pressure protesting between iron and oak. For the workers within the courtyard of Tottenham Court Road Brewery, it heralded catastrophic loss for the residents of Street Giles's slums, whether slumbering, laboring, or merely enduring that damp October afternoon. The sound emanating from beyond the towering brick wall was too swift for comprehension. After the groan came a snap, as clean and complete as a giant femur breaking, followed by a brief silence, a moment of held breath, then an exhalation. The brewery's rear wall stood 20-5 feet high, thick enough to withstand any lesser impact. Yet now it offered no resistance. It did not collapse, but toppled like a toy soldier. Port beer, that deep, viscous slime did not spatter, but flowed like solid matter, forming a 15-foot high mass of viscous liquid, ink-black beneath London's grey sky, its surface churning with murky, creamy foam. Churning with murky, creamy foam. It first devastated the brewery's own barrel storehouse. Hundreds of casks toppled, their contents merging into the initial torrent. The volume of beer now surging forth was biblical. Well over 1 million pints of liquid surged forth, straight for the lowest ground, and the jumbled slum alleys behind the brewery proved the perfect low-lying area. The flood surged along the path of least resistance, through the narrow lane called New Street. New Street was less a thoroughfare than a gorge clamped between crude brick tenements, where the city's most impoverished Irish immigrants dwelt. 3 or even from minor-story buildings leaned against one another for support, their foundations sunk deep into London's damp clay. Here the floodwaters gathered and accelerated, no longer an ordinary deluge, but a hydraulic battering ram. The first house to bear the brunt belonged to some nameless family. Its facade was utterly obliterated. The thick, heavy beer slammed against the fragile brick and timber frontage, tearing the entire building inwards. Floors collapsed like stacked whip playing cards. The scene was not punctuated by the sharp crack of shattering glass or splintering timber, but by a dull, damp crunch like crushing rotten apples. Black liquid into the newly formed void, instantly filling the gap before surging onward, now dragging brick dust in its wake. A muddy torrent surged with shattered furniture and human remains. A few doors down, Tavistock Arms stood at the junction of New Street and Great Russell Street. This humble refuge bore dust-laden window panes, its air thick with the scent of clay pipes and spilled juniper berries. Behind the bar, a girl named Eleanor Coop polished glasses. Barely 14 or 15, she'd worked here less than a year. She might have heard the rumble building, a low growl shaking the floorboards. But in this quarter, accustomed to the clatter of hooves, the clang of rolling barrels and industrial din, this sound was scarcely perceived as an imminent threat. The threat did not come from outside the door. Instead, it pierced the walls. The pub's rear wall adjoined the brewery's edge. Now it bore the same immense pressure as the main wall had when it collapsed. The structure bulged inward in an instant. Plaster shattered into fine dust, drifting down. Then it disintegrated completely. A churning wall of pitch-black porter breached the taproom, tossing heavy wooden tables haphazardly, shattering every window from within. This pressure closed in on Eleanor Cooper, trapped behind a sturdy oak bar, with no escape. Her workstation became a prison. A surging tide of beer pressed her against the rear wall. The alcoholic torrent filled the cramped space at terrifying speed. The pub owner and several patrons, fortunate enough to be near the Russell Street entrance, were either swept out onto the street or scrambled onto the bar to escape. As the floodwaters rose, they heard Eleanor's cries for help, but the murky torrent of debris rendered any rescue attempt futile. Within minutes, the water level inside the pub reached the ceiling. The pitch-black liquid churned with shards of glass, broken chairs, and the everyday refuse of a London pub. The sounds from behind the bars eased abruptly. The Tavistock structure had been severely compromised. The cellar was completely submerged, transformed into a tomb. Across the narrow street, the second building endured a similar ultimate torment. This two-story dwelling was densely populated. After the flood destroyed the first building, it now carried its wreckage, transformed into a liquid bulldozer. It surged forward, propelling churning bricks, timber beams, and the remains of entire houses. These fragments ground against the facade of the second building like abrasive grit. The aged mortar crumbled first. Loose bricks broke free, swallowed by the torrent. The building's base seemed to melt. The upper story fractured. After seconds of surreal suspension, the roofline caved in. Finally collapsing, the entire structure caved inward, pressed like a mill minus fuel into its own cellar, vanishing into the black, frothy flood. The flood's initial kinetic energy, spent in destruction, began to spread outward, pooling in the low-lying areas of George Street and New Street, filling every cellar along its path, basements and sunken kitchens. The air, once damp with coal smoke, turned thick and viscous, suffocating with a sweet, malty stench, the scent of London porter. The destruction of New Street took less than 5 minutes. The true horror of the catastrophe lay not in the collapsing brick walls or the shattered timber beams of street-level houses, but in the abyss beneath St. Giles's slum. The poverty of this vertical slum was layered. The true gravity of the calamity lay not in the crumbling masonry or splintered beams of street-level dwelling, but in the spectacle beneath the slums of St. Giles. This vertical slum's destitution was not merely stacked by story, but ascended by depth. The most desperate and destitute dwelled underground, in damp, lightless cellars beneath the shanties. These were not basements in the modern sense, but pits in the earthen ground, devoid of ventilation, linked to the world above by a single steep wooden staircase. They were cheap and wretched, and on the afternoon of 17 October 1814, they became inescapable traps. Gravity, obeying fundamental physical laws, crushed the entire structure flat, plunging into its own cellars, vanishing into churning black torrents. The flood's initial kinetic energy, slightly diminished by destruction, swiftly spread outward, pooling in the low-lying areas of George Street and New Street, connected to the world above by a single steep wooden staircase. Cheapened, bleak dwellings, transformed into a hopeless predicament on the afternoon of 17 October 1814. Obeying the laws of physics, the rain sought the lowest point, pouring through the shattered ground-floor windows, rushing down the staircase, seeping through floorboards' cracks, cascading like a waterfall into the cellar. For these basement dwellers, there was no warning, only the sudden onslaught of a cold, dark, suffocating torrent. In the cellar of 20 New Street, a wake was being held, a deeply ingrained Irish tradition, where stories and feasting bid farewell to the departed to dispel sorrow. The deceased was to -old John Soville, who had passed away the day before. His 40 -year -old mother and Soville presided over the mournful gathering. Surrounding her were Hannah and other relatives, friends, and neighbours. Field arrived with his for -year, -old daughter, Catherine Mary Mulvey. 30 -year, -old Mary Mulvey brought her 3 -year, -old son, Thomas Murray. 60 -5 -year, -old neighbour Elizabeth Smith, and 18 -year, -old John Dagan were also present. In the cramped room, several flickering tallow candles faintly dispelled the subterranean gloom. The air was thick with damp earth and human odour, faintly tinged with death's subtle scent. This gathering of the impoverished mourned their kin, huddled together in this modest rite of sorrow. The first sign of calamity was the tremor in the floorboards. Then dust and debris cascaded from the ceiling, followed by a thunderous roar. A torrent of black liquid surged down the narrow cellar steps. This was no gentle flow, but a violent flood, a beer-like wave carrying street debris, mashing through the flimsy door at the top of the stairs, pouring into the cellar like water into a bucket. Chaos reigned in the darkness. Candles flickered out. The force of the water knocked people to the floor, slamming them against damp brick walls. And Saville, mourning her lost child, now found herself fighting for survival, battling for the lives of those around her. Hannah Banfield desperately clutched at her daughter Catherine, disoriented in the churning darkness, with nowhere to flee. Beneath the low ceiling, the sole exit now spewed a torrent of suffocating flood. Beer instantly flooded the cramped space, pressing them against the ceiling, sucking away the last breath. At the funeral of -year, -old John Saville, 7 more souls were added, all drowned together in the dark cellar. The flood was no ordinary water, but the product of London's largest brewery. This tragedy layered upon tragedy, its absurd, cruel circumstances deepening the sorrow. In the cellars of this street, such family tragedies repeated themselves. The victims almost exclusively women and children, those most likely to be home alone on a Monday afternoon. 60 -3 -year, -old widow Catherine Butler lived alone in a nearby cellar, when discovered drowned. Floodwaters had risen to the ceiling of her cramped room. The fate of Eleanor Cooper, a young maid at Tavistock Hotel, was similarly sealed, though her death occurred above ground. The mechanism was identical, trapped in an enclosed space. The liquid rose far too swiftly for human escape, ultimately succumbing to both crushing pressure and drowning. Victims both of the flood's immense force, and souls lost to its suffocating torrent. 8 perished, and Saville, Hannah Banfield, Catherine Banfield, Mary Mulvey, Thomas Murray, Elizabeth Smith, John Dagan, and Dylan or Cooper. Their names form a modest register of sorrow, a mere footnote in London's grand historical narrative. Yet they bear the full human cost of that day. They did not perish in fire, plague, or epical upheaval, but perished when a large fermenting barrel of dark ale, the symbol of British commerce, failed. The forgotten souls of the city's underbelly, drowned in beer. Such an absurd end borders on farce, yet it feels like material for a nightmare. Their final moments were steeped in darkness, cold, and the pungent scent of strung port ale. After the flood receded, New Street's ruins lay shrouded in an eerie, deathly stillness, the silence frozen in shock. Only the dripping of fluid from broken beams and the dull groan of collapsing structures broke the quiet. The flood's furious roar had faded, leaving behind a scene of profound devastation. Streets vanished, replaced by shallow lakes of black beer. Upon the surface floated the desolate fragments of shattered lives, a woman's headscarf, a child's wooden toy, a chair leg, pages of a book, ink seeping into the inky liquid, the air thick with the pungent vapor of alcohol and the chalky scent of crushed brick and plaster. The ground beneath their feet transformed into treacherous, sticky sludge. This was the scene witnessed by the first rescuers. They were not professionals. There was no fire brigade, no organist emergency services. In London, 1814, it was the neighbours who acted first, the survivors, those who heard the roar, those who felt the tremor in the alleyways. They stepped outside, into a world already transformed. Their initial reaction was shock and disbelief. Familiar streets replaced by pools of beer. For -story buildings reduced to rubble piles barely waist high. Such sights defy ordinary experience. Yet doubt swiftly gave way to desperate cries for help, echoing from the ruins muffled groans, the wails of the injured, the sobs of those who'd lost everything. The rescue operation began in chaotic, disorganized salvage effort. People dug with their bare hands. The rescue operation commenced in chaotic, disorganized salvage efforts. People moved bricks and splintered planks with their bare hands, wading through bare waist deep, unmindful of the cold or hidden shards beneath the water. The ruins of 2 collapsed buildings on New Street became the focal point. Work he was fraught with peril. Mountains of brick and timber teetered precariously, threatening to collapse anew at any moment. Local constables and parish officials arrived at the scene armed only with lanterns on civic duty. Symbolic things of chaotic and utterly dysfunctional authority. Faced with the chaos, they could only observe, attempting to guide civilian rescuers to avoid injury. From the ruins of the first building, they successfully rescued several survivors, dazed, covered in wounds, and caked in a sludge of beer and brick dust. The proprietor of Tavistock pub and several patrons were rescued from precarious perches atop the bar counter. They reported that young waitress Eleanor remained trapped inside. Yet the pub had become a death trap, a dark, waterlogged space, teeming with shifting rubble. Any attempt to enter would be tantamount to suicide. Rescue efforts shifted to the larger pile of debris at the site of the second house, the one where Anne Sovell was keeping vigil for her son. Neighbors knew someone was in the cellar. Over a dozen men formed a human chain, passing bricks and fragments of plaster, painstakingly clearing a passage to the cellar entrance. This bare-handed labor was slow and agonizing, scraping by with only the few shovels and crowbars salvaged from the brewery yard. As time wore on, a strange, surreal atmosphere seeped into the disaster site. Rumors of a beer deluge spread like wildfire through the slums and beyond. Curious onlookers began gathering at the disaster's edge. Residents, however, were driven by a more primal instinct. Beer flowed freely through the streets. For this starving populace, it was an almost unbelievable gift. Some scooped the liquid with pots, bowls, ladles, even hats. Rumors circulated, perhaps exaggerated, yet rooted in grim reality, of people lying directly on the pavement, drinking freely from the drains. In the days that followed, whispers emerged of a 9th victim, one who hadn't perished in the floodwaters, but succumbed to alcohol poisoning after guzzling the freely flowing port beer. This tale might be pure fiction, merely a somber folk legend attached to the event. The rumored 9th casualty did not perish in the flood, but succumbed to alcohol poisoning after guzzling freely flowing port wine. This tale may well be pure fiction, merely a somber folk legend attached to the disaster, yet it authentically mirrors the absurd scene where despair coexisted with grotesque revelry. As dusk fell on the 17th of October, the scene presented a Domtain Quay as torches and lanterns cast flickering, illusory shadows across the ruins. The viscous, dark liquid covering the ground reflected the flame, casting a hellish glow over the entire area. Amidst the collapsed cellar ruins, the frantic digging continued, but hope was fading. Rescuers, utterly exhausted, covered in grime, worked in a sombrous island. The pungent scent of port beer began mingling with another odor, the unmistakable stench of death. The process of retrieving bodies from the cellar would take hours. They processed both meticulous and heart-wrenching, lifting timber beam, clearing rubble, so debris might reach that dark, confined space where 8 lives ended in utter futility. This London-beer deluge, this unprecedented, grotesque industrial catastrophe, has concluded its brief, violent journey, leaving behind a zone of localized, total devastation, a shattered community, and a bizarre tragedy that would echo through the city's history. This is a cautionary tale of progress, poverty, and the catastrophic failure of giant beer vats. Though the metropolis of London, heart of a global empire, was not utterly destroyed, its most impoverished corners were swept clean by a torrent of its most famous export. Tuesday morning, 18 October 1814. The bright dawn brought no clarity, but laid bare the previous night's chaos. The morning sun over St. Giles's slums illuminated a scene of profound destruction, woven in shades of brown and grey. The air, once suffused with the cloying sweetness of dried port wine, now carried a heavier, more sinister undertone, the damp stench of decay. Wet plaster and splintered wood shavings mingled deeper with the odour of some organic matter. This was the scene George Hodgson beheld as Middlesex's officially appointed coroner. His arrival was no cause for celebration. This official, accustomed to ledgers and legal precedents, now stepped into a world of primal, incomprehensible grief. His task seemed simple on paper, but proved impossible in practice to impose the rigid logic of the King's law upon an event that defied all logic. He did not establish court in grand halls London's justice, especially the lower courts, which often operated with greater personal touch and practicality. The inquest was held at St. Giles's parish poorhouse, just a few streets from the heart of the disaster. In that humble room, normally dealing with the tragedies of the destitute, a jury was swiftly assembled. Local traders, tavern keepers, master craftsmen, men whose lives followed the steady rhythm of commerce and trade, were now asked to comprehend the terrifying force that had shattered that rhythm. Before hearing testimony, they faced the most brutal task, witnessing the mangled bodies firsthand. They were a group governed by the laws of commerce, yet now compelled to comprehend the destructive force that shattered life's rhythm. Before hearing testimony, their foremost duty proved the most cruel. They must personally identify the remains. The search and rescue operation proved arduous and slow. The initial piles of rubble had formed a jagged new landscape. Once minor solid walls had become hazardous heaps of brick and timber, heavy as mountains after soaking. The cellars, those cramped spaces that had once housed the parish's poorest families, had become graves. The cellars where the parish's poorest families had taken shelter were now graves. They were not submerged by water, but filled with viscous liquids and rubble minus laden sludge substances requiring shovels rather than pumps to clear. Parish officers and volunteers labored through the night until dawn. Lanterns cast dancing, elongated shadows upon the muck. They advanced guided by faint cries for help until all sound ceased. Then, in the deepest silence, they began to dig. Victims were discovered one by 1:30 year, minus sold Mary Mulvey and her son Thomas. Not yet 4 were found in the cellar of 22 Great Russell Street, where they had been sharing afternoon tea with another family. The collapse's destructive force had utterly consumed the space, and Saville, mother of 2 children present at the scene, was rescued from the same rubble. Then came the Irish wake. Mourners gathered in the cellar on New Street to lament the 2-year-old boy who had perished the day before. A flood of beer overwhelmed this solemn gathering, transforming a single tragedy into multiple disasters. For bodies were found at the scene: Hannah Banfield, aged just 4.5, her 30-year-old mother Eleanor, the 60-5-year-old widow Catherine Butler, and a young man named John Farr, the 8th victim. The body of Sarah Bates, a maid of about 10 years, was discovered in the cellar of the Tavistock Inn, adjacent to the brewery. She had been washing earthenware pots. The ordinary sound of pewter striking stone had echoed moments before, only to vanish into endless darkness. The jurors were accustomed to examining bodies laid out neatly in clean rooms. Yet now they were confronted with this horror. The victims had not merely drowned. They had been crushed under heavy weight, their bodies covered in wounds before being submerged. Coroner Hodgson, sir, weighed everything with seasoned professional composure. The clerk meticulously recorded every detail. The cause of death for each body was brutally and irrefutably clear. After the inquest concluded, the jury returned to the workhouse. The cloying sweetness of strong porter seemed to cling to their garments. The first witnesses were summoned, workers from the Max's brewery. Their testimony proved crucial, not merely for its content, but for sketching the critical moments preceding the catastrophe. Warehouse clerk George Creek stood as the pivotal witness. This meticulous man viewed the brewery as a living organism, composed of pipes, vats, and production schedules. In measured tones he described the colossal at the pride of the company. He explained, standing 20-2 feet tall, a wooden owl structure secured by massive iron hoops. He testified, holding 3,500 barrels of beer, a quantity almost beyond imagination. On Monday, the 17th, around 4:30 in the afternoon, secured by iron hoops, he testified it held 3,500 barrels of Proterra quantity, almost beyond imagination. Around 4:30 Monday, the 17th, Creek noticed an anomaly in the warehouse. The iron hoops on the giant cask had lifted. He emphasized this was not an emergency alert, as large vessels frequently develop such issues due to pressure, temperature fluctuations, and natural deformation of timber and iron. He had anticipated this. Proceeding according to protocol, he wrote a report to Mr. Yang, the brewery's chief steward, recommending notification of the cooper for repairs purely routine maintenance. He testified that Mr. Yang, having reviewed the report, deemed the matter adequately addressed. There was neither panic nor apocalyptic foreboding at the scene, merely another item on the 2-do list. 1 hour later, George Creek stood at another location within the brewery, a mere 30 feet from the colossal fermentation vats, when he heard that unforgettable roar, either an explosion nor a crack, but what he described as an earth-shattering tear, as if the very fabric of the structure itself had been ripped apart. As the world disintegrated amid the liquid roaring flying splinters, he was thrown to the ground. Testimonies from other workers corroborated his account. The fermenter they spoke of was not faulty equipment, but what they called a reliable beast that had suddenly malfunctioned for unknown reasons. The testimonies unanimously depicted not negligence, but a sudden, unexplained, complete structural collapse. Survivors who later emerged from the rubble recounted fragmented memories from the heart of the chaos. A woman spoke of hearing a thunderclap from a clear sky. Another described walls vanishing into thin air, replaced by a roaring torrent of darkness reeking of tavern, narrating the tavern's horrific dismemberment. The disappearance of maid Sarah Bates. He and his family only survived by clambering onto floating roof fragments. Their testimonies touched not upon iron rings or maintenance records, but upon the primal terror of a world violently shattered in an instant. They described pressure, suffocating darkness, and the desperate gasping for breath not in water, but in a viscous, frothy mixture of alcohol. The jury listened in silence, their faces grave. They had seen the corpses, and now heard the final gasps of lives abruptly ended. The evidence was presented. The detached iron hoops mentioned in the routine report, the catastrophic rupture of the brewing vats, and the devastating loss of life. The coroner's court's duty was not civil accountability, but determining the cause of death. Yet within this cramped chamber, a deeper question hung like a hammer suspended in the air. Was this merely a tragic accident, or was there more to it? Was anyone to blame? The initial shock of the testimony, which lasted 2 days, gradually gave way to a more measured, almost mechanical legal process. After hearing statements from brewery employees and survivors, the jury must weigh the evidence to render individual verdicts for each of the 8 deceased. The pivotal question centered on foreseeability. Could the brewery's owner, Mook's company, reasonably have anticipated the colossal vat failing in such catastrophic fashion? Was the loose ring discovered by George Creek a clear warning sign, grossly neglected through negligence, or, as he testified, merely a routine maintenance issue, no more dangerous than loose roof tiles? Though the brewery itself was not formally charged, it was undeniably at the heart of the trial. Through employee testimony, a clear factual narrative emerged. This giant vat was no obsolete, discarded vessel, but a masterpiece of cooperage, both a priceless industrial asset and a symbol of the brewery's market dominance. Constructed from premium materials, subjected to regular inspections, it had reliably contained vast volumes of liquid for years. The iron hoops securing the vessel were not flimsy straps, but forged metal rings, each weighing hundreds of pounds. The brewery indirectly contended through its staff, though the collapse constituted an unforeseeable incident, a case of sudden and complete failure. The reinforced iron hoops were not fragile straps, but forged metal rings, each weighing hundreds of pounds. The brewery indirectly conveyed its position through clerks and brewers. This collapse was an unforeseeable incident, a sudden, total failure of the material. No reasonable maintenance could have prevented it. They were not merely brewers, but pioneers of industrial scale, operating at the very edge of contemporary technology. And technology, at times, simply fails. A jury of local craftsmen heard the testimony. These were not easily swayed. Radical anti-minus industrialists. They belonged to the same commercial ecosystem as the brewery, and understood that business inherently carries risk. In their eyes, a horseshoe brewery was not an evil force, but a local landmark, a vital employer and commercial engine, injecting capital and vitality into the region. To find the brewery criminally negligent would be tantamount to attacking a community pillar, and set a perilous precedent. In London, this city of industry, teeming with steam engines, factories and warehouses, accidents were commonplace. Boiler explosions, scaffolding collapses. To demand business owners be held accountable for every incident, few in the business world would dare take such a step. The entire framework of the Industrial Revolution was built upon a certain tolerance for risk, a burden primarily borne by the impoverished laboring in the shadows of industrial giants. Thus the jury commenced deliberation. The process may not have been lengthy. The simplest solution was evident. There was no evidence of deliberate intent, nor of prolonged disregard for safety. Only a routine observation record of a loose iron band an hour before the catastrophe. Faced with such sudden calamity, attributing it to physical laws rather than human error proved legally more prudent. Coroner George Hodgson called the court to order and read the verdicts for the 8 victims: Murray Mulvey and her son Thomas, and Surrey, Anna Banfield and her mother Eleanor, Catherine Butler, John Farr, Sarah Bates. The verdicts were identical. All deaths resulted from accident and misfortune. This constitutes the court's formal legal determination. Anna Banfield and her mother Eleanor, Catherine Butler, John Farr and Sarah Bates. The jury found all perished through accident and misfortune. This constitutes the formal legal expression for deaths for which no one is liable. Within the legal mindset of the time, this fell under the category of acts of God, a peculiar term suggesting divine intervention, such as a thunderstorm or earthquake. Yet, here it is applied to an artificial object. The explosion of a beer barrel was legally equated with a hurricane. For this catastrophe, too vast, too bizarre, and too costly to attribute to the proprietor, it became a convenient umbrella term. The verdict functioned as a pardon. Henry Mooks and his partners were absolved of all criminal liability. The law scrutinized the catastrophe in Street Giles and classified it as a tragedy without fault. The bereaved families received no compensation from the company. Their loss was purely the bitter price of survival in the age of giant barrels and industrial progress. Yet the brewery's nightmare was not over. Though they evaded legal punishment, they faced another trial, the harsh scrutiny of the balance sheet. Financial losses were catastrophic. Over 3,500 barrels of premium porter beer vanished, worth thousands of pounds. Factory walls collapsed and equipment was utterly destroyed. Repair costs combined with inventory losses threatened to push the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Yet MOXs enjoyed powerful patrons. They were not impoverished Irish tenants, but wealthy commercial magnates. Their petition to Parliament sought not relief for victims, but self-redemption. They argued the vast quantities of beer soaking St. Giles's soil had long since been paid to the Crown in excise duties. To demand both compensation for the lost beer and repayment of these duties would amount to a double blow. Parliament, ever sympathetic to industrial hardship, passed an act of monument to the callous values of the age, exempting the government from the taxes. The brewers received a refund of approximately £7,000. This substantial sum effectively saved their business. The state had absolved them of liability and funded their recovery. As for the bereaved families, officialdom took no action. The legal proceedings concluded. The verdict delivered. The brewery stood unscathed. 8 bodies were quietly interred in St. Giles Field Cemetery. Their deaths were officially classified as an unfortunate accident, the work of some particularly indifferent deity, with the legal proceedings concluded, and the brewery cleared of suspicion. The very nature of the area around Great Russell Street began to transform. The initial frenzy of rescue efforts subsided, and the bloody wound in the city's fabric became a spectacle. The tale of London's beer deluge spread like wildfire, propagated through newspapers and word of mouth. This was a legend uniquely London, gritty, sinister, and tragic. Thus crowds descended. They poured in from across the city, from Mayfair's elegant squares to Wapping's bustling docks, all to gaze upon the scene of disaster. A wave of morbid curiosity swept through St. Giles, replacing the former tide of port wine. This neighbourhood, where the respectable classes usually passed with pinched noses, became a tourist attraction. Carriages clogged the surrounding streets. The wealthy peered at the ruins from a safe distance. The foot-bound Londoners formed a human wall that halted the city's daily rhythm. They stared at the collapsed houses, the brewery's shattered remains, and the vast, dark scar marking the flood's peak. The air still carried the faint scent of stale ale, now mingled with brick dust and the sombre odour of the graveyard. The flood had shifted tombstone and churned the earth of the parish burial ground. This crowd was not a single entity, but a composite of distinct groups, each with their own purpose. Some were mere onlookers, drawn by this unprecedented spectacle. A beer flood was legendary, a tale to be recounted in taverns for years to come. They pointed and gestured, whispered among themselves, imagining the roar of the torrent and the terror of those swept away. Their presence felt like an uncanny intrusion, almost festive in its clamour, invading this place of mourning. For them, this catastrophe had become a concept, a scene within the city's theatre. Souvenir hunters in an age before photography, people craved tangible imprints of momentous events. They jostled parish constables attempting to maintain order, seeking relic splinters from giant beer barrel planks, crumbs of collapsed cellar walls, shattered pottery, shards from ruined houses, any object that might forge a tangible link to the story. They were not necessarily bloodthirsty, but rather continued a tradition passed down from they carried home a piece of history, however bleak, deep within the ruins. Acting with a purpose utterly distinct from idle onlookers were the scavengers, the residents of St. Giles. Their homes might have been spared, yet their existence teetered perpetually on the razor's edge of destitution. For them, this catastrophe was no spectacle, but an opportunity born of chaos. They sifted through rubble not for mementos, but for anything salvageable to sell: a section of lead pipe, a few intact floorboards, a miraculously intact copper pot in an economy where half pennies were precious. The ruins of neighbors' homes became desperate sources of income. Such is the brutal, unforgiving reality of survival in the slums, where survival trumps all. It is precisely this peculiar, crowded and desperate atmosphere that gave birth to the most enduring legend of London's beer flood, the tale of drunken revelry. This story began circulating, from mouth to mouth, each retelling adding embellishment. It is said that when beer flooded the streets, the residents of Street Giles, far from fleeing in terror, rushed out with every receptacle they could find: pots, pans, buckets, even bare hands to scoop up the free nectar. The tale gradually evolved into a harrowing vision of collective drunkenness amidst death and ruin. Certain versions even claimed people knelt in the gutters, lapping up the beer like cattle. Newspapers, particularly the more sensationalist ones, subtly insinuated that this story perfectly aligned with the public's prejudices against the Street Giles residents, mostly impoverished Irish immigrants, confirming every suspicion the respectable classes harbored about them debauched and drunkards, suggesting the incident. His tale perfectly aligned with society's prejudices against Street Giles's residents, mostly impoverished Irish descendants, validating every criticism leveled by the respectable classes. Irresponsible and drunkards, utterly devoid of dignity, capable of twisting even the most harrowing tragedy into a hedonistic revelry. Yet the truth, as ever, proved complex and murky. In a neighborhood where port beer was considered a luxury, someone attempting to collect the beer was entirely plausible after all. In Street Giles, a pint of port beer was a luxury, when thousands of gallons of beer flowed freely through the streets. For some, allowing it to go to waste was an irresistible temptation, a veritable sin. Thus it is entirely plausible that people scooped up whatever beer they could with buckets and basins, perhaps for drinking, perhaps for resale, but the spectacle of revelry amidst death was almost certainly a gross exaggeration, a folk legend born to entertain the masses and enforce social stereotypes. The beer in the streets was not clean. It was mixed with mud, horse manure, sewage, and debris from destroyed houses. The torrent that claimed 8 lives was a brutal, terrifying force, not a gentle stream. The prevailing sentiment in Street Giles that night was not thirst, but dread, yet the legend persists. It is more melodious, more dramatic, more entertaining, and perfectly aligns with the narrative of the undeserving dead. The tale of drinking from the sewers obscures the tragedy of Mary Mulvey and her 3-year-old son crushed to death in their cellar. This catastrophe was ultimately reduced to a darkly comic folk tale, a tragic industrial accident transformed into black humor. A 9th flood minus related death, added to later accounts, further embellished the legend. Thomas Mansfield allegedly perished days later from alcohol poisoning after consuming copious amounts of salvaged port wine. Though neither the coroner's inquest nor early reliable accounts mention this individual, his tale became an integral part of the legend, transformed into cautionary dark humor. In the weeks that followed, the crowds gradually dispersed. The rubble was slowly cleared. The brewery, spared bankruptcy by parliamentary tax relief, began the arduous process of reconstruction. The collapsed houses were eventually demolished, foundations leveled, new edifices rose. The city functioned as before, yet London's beer deluge was never wholly forgotten. It settled into the city's collective memory, preserved not by the dry prose of coroner's reports, but by vivid, unreliable accounts officially deemed an act of God, merely a legal fiction, to shield the powerful and preserve the status quo. Instead, it lived on in popular legend, which froze the day into a tragicomic farce as beer surged through London's streets. The city's poorest greeted the catastrophe with thirsty smiles. The victims, despair and the cold logic of industrial economics, were both washed away by a more compelling and potent narrative deep within the ledgers of the mix company. Another flood was silently gathering, a torrent of deficits, The disaster at Tottenham Court Road was viewed by the law and the company's partners not primarily as a humanitarian tragedy, but as an unprecedented loss of vast stock. The common law of 1814 offered scant protection to the dwellers of street jails, slums. The doctrine of corporate negligence had yet to be established to address such industrial accident. The notion of holding companies liable for catastrophic failures of their own machinery, such bizarre occurrences deemed acts of God, had yet to mature. The coroner ruled the deaths accidental. The company was thus absolved of legal responsibility. Such bizarre occurrences deemed acts of God, the notion had yet to mature. The coroner ruled the deaths accidental. Thus, the legal liability of the Horse Hoe Brewery towards the victims and their families was effectively concluded. Perhaps for the sake of public decorum, a few pounds might be donated to a charitable fund, but there would be no litigation, no structural compensation, or admission of fault. The real crisis facing Sir Henry Moxham and his partners Thomas and Henry Woolworth was not legal but financial, specifically a matter of taxation. The British government, mired in the final stages of the Napoleonic Wars, relied heavily on excise duties to shoulder its fiscal burdens. Among such taxes levied on domestically produced and consumed goods, few categories proved as stable and heavily taxed as beer. The duty per barrel of port constituted an indispensable and negotiable component of its cost. This tax became payable to the Crown the instant the tax officer measured the volume. The moment the tax officer measured its volume, long before the product was sold, the brewery effectively functioned as a tax collection agency, obliged to remit funds to the government as a priority. When the colossal cask ruptured, it not only spilled over 1,000 gallons of potential profit, but triggered a torrent of prepaid taxes, the lost port beer equating to 3,500 to 4,000 finished barrels. Estimates suggest the lost excise duty alone amounted to £725 for a modern enterprise. Such a loss might prove manageable even in 1814, even for an establishment of horseshoe brewery stature. Yet at that time, it amounted to a death sentence, a tax equivalent to £2 millions today, sufficient to plunge the business into irreversible bankruptcy on the spot. The value of destroyed facilities, the fermentation vats themselves, damaged walls, contaminated cellars, another equally horrifying expense. But taxation was the poison of the moment. This was a debt owed to the state, and the state is always a ruthless creditor, especially when it was funding Wellington's armies on the European continent. Therefore, the partners of Mooks did not spend their days lamenting the dead, but engaged in meticulous, urgent consultations with solicitors. They marshalled ledgers, production records, and correspondence with the tax commission. Then they turned their gaze to the only institution that could save them, Parliament. Through parliamentary channels, they submitted a private petition to the House of Commons. This was no public spectacle, but a meticulously orchestrated political lobbying effort. The petition exemplified calculated modesty and economic pragmatism. It emphasized the company's long-standing history as a reliable taxpayer and major local employer, while attributing the disaster to unforeseeable divine providence, not managerial or maintenance failings. In the words of the coroner's jury, it was an unavoidable accident. The coroner's jury's wording. The core argument was succinct and devastating. Without relief, this horseshoe brewery, one of London's industrial engines, would collapse. Hundreds of workers would become parish paupers. Its vital contribution to the exchequer would cease. Capital invested by the enterprise would be lost, causing a chill in financial markets. This debate was not about fairness or sympathy, but one of stability. The Conservative government under Lord Liverpool was fundamentally committed to safeguarding property, maintaining order, and preserving the nation's economic machinery. Allowing a major brewery to collapse due to an accident beyond human control, and one for which no legal liability existed, would be a grave misjudgment. Rather than permitting the brewery's complete disappearance, and forfeiting this future tax revenue. Exempting the lost beer from duty proved the wiser course. The petition, having been considered by the committee, is hereby approved. The excise duty owed on over 3,500 barrels of port wine soaked in the St. Giles land is wholly remitted. This constitutes, in essence, one of the earliest corporate bailouts in history, a privately owned enterprise saved by taxpayers' money, whose operations led to the deaths of neighbours. The public charity fund for victims raised merely a few £100s, distributed in shillings and pennies to bereaved families, yet the lifeline extended to the brewery, through parliamentary legislation, exceeded this sum by 20-fold. This action provoked public protest, and newspapers reporting the petition rated it as dry financial record minus keeping, in an era before income tax was levied, when the state's finances depended on such revenues. The logic was clear: the brewery represented tangible assets for the national treasury, whereas the residents of St. Giles slums did not. At that time, the state's finances relied heavily on such revenues. For the political and business elite, the reasoning was straightforward. The brewery constituted tangible assets for the national treasury, whereas the residents of St. Giles slums did not. With a stroke of the legislative pen, the company's future was secured. Mooks began the slow and chaotic clean minus-up operation, paying salvage crews to dismantle the massive, shuttered fermentation vats, and engaged masons to rebuild the factory walls. They pumped out the foul smelling residue from the cellars, and tallied the losses of intact barrels crushed in the flood. The accounts were finally balanced. The spectre of bankruptcy receded, yet within the ledgers, the names of the 8 deceased weren't ever recorded, mere external factors in the cold arithmetic of survival. Unfortunate yet ultimately inconsequential details. Enterprises surviving the deluge would continue operations. The reconstruction of the Horseshoe Brewery became an industrial manifesto of confidence. When one colossal vat fell, others would rise to take its place. No major regulatory reform. No new government bodies established to inspect the structural integrity of brewing vessels. This catastrophe was deemed a tragic anomaly, a minus million failure, rather than a systemic issue stemming from the relentless expansion of industrial scale. Thus London's brewers learned their lesson not through legislation, but via a whispered industry legend. Coopers might scrutinize the quality of iron hoops more closely. Engineers might double minus check, load minus bearing wall calculations. A new tacit understanding and awareness of the terrifying potential energy contained within 250,000 gallons of liquid now permeated industry norm. Yet superficially, business continued as usual. The Horseshoe Brewery, saved from bankruptcy by the state government's generous bailout, welcomed the height of summer. Within industry conventions, a tacit understanding prevails of the terrifying potential energy contained within 250,000 gallons of liquid. Yet outwardly, all remains the same. Horseshoe Brewery, saved from collapse by state generosity, continues as an industry titan through the Victorian midsummer, brewing vast quantities of London porter. This nourishing, dark, smoky brew served as the very lifeblood sustaining the city's lumbering classes. Steam engines hissed and whistled as mighty Chiron Clydesdale horses laboured along cobbled streets, hauling wagons laden with casks to thousands of city taverns. The great flood of 1814 now seemed a distant, eerie tale, a legend spun by the brewery's old craftsmen to frighten new apprentices. The brewery complex at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street stood as a landmark, a vast compound of brickwork and steam machinery, the air perpetually thick with the cloying sweetness of boiling wort. Yet brewing, like the world itself, was changing. Indeed, the very mastery of porter brewing that had secured Horseshoe Brewery's dominance gradually became a shackle by mid-19th century. A new style of beer quietly emerged, first captivating the middle classes, then sweeping the nation. born in breweries along the Trent at Burton upon Trent. The local spring water, rich in gypsum, proved the holy grail for brewing this novel beer. Pale in color, crisp in taste, and rich in hops, this beer, known as Pale Ale or Indian Pale Ale, was the very symbol of the future. Though London brewers possessed soft water and centuries of tradition, and mastered the art of brewing dark beers like port and stout, yet found themselves unable to replicate the fashionable new pale ale. Public taste was shifting from the rich, nourishing porters of the Georgian era towards brighter, crisper brews. Horseshoe Brewery, like all successful enterprises, adapted as German brewing traditions crossed the English Channel. It began brewing pale ales and lagers, upgrading equipment, and invested in new technology to fiercely defend its market share amid intensifying competition. Yet its very essence remained defined by location at heart. It was a London porter brewery, a product of the old world. The flood was a sudden upheaval, while the challenges of the late 19th to early 20th century were a slow eroding crisis. Dominance was gradually slipping away. A major merger occurred in 1909, when the then named Moxie's Brewing Limited joined forces with its London rival, the Reed Brewery of Clerkenwell. The new entity was briefly known as Moxie-Reed. It was believed at the time that this merger would ensure the survival of the historic Horseshoe-shaped brewery site. Yet the forces shaping the site were no longer solely about beer, but about the city itself. West London was transforming. The area around Tottenham Court Road was shedding its reputation as a bleak expanse of slums and heavy industry. It was evolving into a fashionable hub for shopping and entertainment. Land values around the brewery soared. By the early 1920s, financial logic had become irreversible. This vast, bustling, foul-smelling industrial complex, with its rumbling lorries and coal-fired boilers, had become situated in prime real estate. Brewing here had become pointless. The land itself was worth far more than any output. In 1921, the final decision fell this establishment, having weathered over 150 years of vicissitude, survived catastrophic industrial accidents, and endured the test of shifting national tastes, was to close. Brewing operations relocated to 9 Elms Brewery in Wandsworth. The colossal fermentation vats were emptied for the last time. The steam engines ground to a halt. The flames in the boilers were extinguished. For over a year thereafter, the site lay silent as a ghost town, its former glory utterly vanquished, until late 1922, when the demolition crews began their work. Bricks were dismantled one by one. Timber beams were removed piece by piece. This landmark structure was utterly dismantled. The Grand Brewing Hall, the cooperage workshop, the stables, the partners, the counting office where financial survival was planned, all reduced to rubble and dust. The stables, the accounts room where partners once plotted financial revival, all reduced to rubble and dust. The deep cellars that once stored priceless beer were also submerged by a deadly, suffocating flood, now buried beneath the very rubble that once supported them. The ground leveled to a flat expanse. The entire industrial world and its most bizarre catastrophe erased from the map. Only bare London clay remains, awaiting a new chapter. The warning of the beer flood has faded, replaced by this metropolis's more modern, more potent lesson. The land's most efficient use ultimately belongs to commerce and entertainment. Thus ended the industrial era of the West End. The vacant lot at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and New Oxford Street became a hollow scar amidst the West End's clamour. Yet a new plan was quietly taking shape, a magnificent masterpiece that would herald the soul of the Jazz Age. In 1928, ground was broken for a new kind of palace, not a royal palace, but a temple for the people. This super-minus cinema was an entertainment sanctuary, seating over 3,000. Its scale was staggering, its design brimming with modern ambition. Fluid geometric Art Deco formed, crafted from reinforced concrete and Portland stone. Architects William and Thomas Ridley Milner conceived a realm utterly detached from reality, raising a captivating, fantastical edifice from industrial ruins. As foundations were excavated, bulldozers churned the soil of street giles, gnawing into and once occupied by fermentation tanks and wine cellars, gnawing into the former site of dilapidated tenements, lining New Street and George Street, where the remnants of the brewery were unearthed, rust-stained wooden barrels, iron hoops, fragments of workers' clay pipes, rough bricks salvaged from collapsed walls, would all be consigned to landfill. Insignificant debris and progress as torrent. This land would no longer prepare vats for fermenting port, but to pave the way for the colossal steel framework of a modern theatre. 1929, the Dominion Theatre unveiled, with a premiere of sound and moving pictures. This revolutionary new technology in cinema transformed the opening night into a dazzling spectacle, a world apart from the squalor and poverty this land had known for centuries. Audiences marveled at the soaring, ornate stage arch, and the exquisite plasterwork, and the plush velvet seats, bathed in the glow of the silver screen, while enveloped in the comfort of air-minus conditioning, their senses saturated by Hollywood's audiovisual feast. Among the premiere night's audience, few were aware of the tragedy that had unfolded here 115 years prior. No monument, no plaque, that strange and deadly flood that had swept through this place. The catastrophe lies utterly buried first beneath reconstruction, and now completely overshadowed by this magnificent new temple of popular culture. For decades, the Dominion Theatre has weathered change, years as a cinema, then a stage for legendary rock concerts. David Bowie, Queen and U2 all graced its stage for the past decades. It has been a stronghold for hit West End musicals, enchanting millions with tales of wizard rock bands and dancing queens. This is a realm where light and shadow intertwine, where music lingers, and thunderous applause resounds. A temple of manufactured delight and collective revelry. Yet beneath the stage, deep within the orchestra pit, beneath the countless tapping toes and standing ovations, another history slumbers silently. These layered remnants resemble London's soil itself, the surface layer, vibrant and pulsing with theatre. Dig slightly deeper to uncover the foundations of 20th century breweries. Those factories were built from disaster. Further down, the ghostly echoes of the original horseshoe-shaped brew houses, and the memory of their deadly fermentation vats. While within the deepest spiritual bedrock, you shall discover traces of street giles, slums, the cellars of the destitute, and 8 lives drowned in such an absurd manner. London's beer flood has been sealed away, reduced to an undercurrent in historical archives. Within this city's annals of grand tragedy, it remains but a bizarre footnote. This catastrophe proved too bizarre, too darkly absurd to fit within the narrative framework of major catastrophes. The Great Fire was divine retribution. The bombing was war, yet the beer flood was an industrial accident involving a mass-produced beverage. It lacks the solemnity we ascribe to deadly events, often eliciting a knowing smile rather than red. Perhaps precisely for this reason, it was utterly erased from the landscape of reality. This awkward memory, both a tale of corporate survival and taxpayers' rescue of industrial pride, while burying the nameless souls of the poor. This past clashes with the neon lights and happy endings of today's West End, the Dominion Theatre's standard routine. So next time you find yourself in London's West End, perhaps passing a theatre en route elsewhere, pause for a moment, gaze upon that grand stone facade, gaze upon the posters advertising the latest productions. Listen with imagination rather than ears beneath the roar of Tottenham Court Road traffic. Amidst the distant sound of bands tuning, you might catch faint traces, the subtle phantom of roasted molten hops, the ghostly echo of a great iron hoop groaning and straining. The moment it finally snapped, you now stand upon the site of history's most bizarre and most forgotten catastrophe. Where once a torrent of beer raged, now lies utter obliteration. The echo of that great iron hoop straining, groaning, and finally breaking the very ground beneath your feet, is the scene of history's most bizarre yet forgotten disaster. Here, the torrent of beer once brought death and destruction, only to be swallowed by a more relentless flood of wealth, the merciless torrent of time, and the relentless flood of this insatiable city's self-minus reinvention. The show must go on.